Hello everyone! Welcome to Literature Revision with Mr. Johnston. Today, we're going to begin analysing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. In this video, we're going to begin with our first extract in Chapter 1, an introduction to Gabriel Utterson. Before we begin, you may be interested in downloading my free resource on this extract. Click a link in the description box below this video to download this resource for free. It comes complete with writing tables for taking notes, short writing tasks, and exemplar paragraphs. And now, let's read our extract. Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of rugged countenance, that was never lighted by a smile. Cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beckoned from his eye. Something, indeed, which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in these silent symbols of the after-dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages, and though he enjoyed the theatre, had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. But he had an approved tolerance for others, sometimes wondering, almost with envy, at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds, and in any extremity inclined to help rather than to reprove. "I incline to Cain's heresy," he used to say. "I let my brother go to the devil in his quaintly young way." In this character, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance, and the last good influence in the lives of downgoing men, and to such as these, so long as they came about his chambers, he never marked a shade of change in his demeanour. This video is going to answer the following question. How does Stevenson present Utterson in this extract? Let's begin with our first idea. Stevenson presents Utterson as a self-disciplined character. A self-disciplined person is self-controlled. If you are self-disciplined, you are able to control your actions and do what is right, even when it is difficult. It takes self-discipline to force yourself out of bed early in the morning. It takes self-discipline to avoid eating cake when you're on a strict diet. And it takes self-discipline to exercise every day. Now, Stevenson describes Utterson as an austere man. This word austere means severe and strict. If you imagine a very strict teacher at school, you could describe that teacher as austere. Now, Utterson isn't strict and austere with other people. Utterson is strict with himself. He tightly controls his behaviour by following a set of moral principles or rules. Let's now take a look at some examples of these moral principles that Utterson follows. First of all, Utterson drinks gin when he is alone to mortify or get rid of his taste for vintages. Now, this word vintages refers to vintage wine. And Utterson has a natural taste for vintage wine, but when he is alone, Utterson drinks gin instead. Utterson drinks gin instead of vintage wine because he wants to mortify or get rid of his taste for vintage wine altogether. Now, why does he want to do this? Well, it's likely that Utterson is well aware of the dangers of an alcohol addiction, and he therefore avoids temptation altogether by drinking gin rather than vintage wine. He knows that if he takes one glass of vintage wine, that one glass might quickly lead to him having 2 or 3 or 4 glasses. So Utterson therefore avoids temptation altogether by not drinking vintage wine at all. Utterson also enjoys the theatre, but he has not attended one for over 20 years. Why was this? Well, in the Victorian era, many people regarded theatres as disreputable establishments. theatres offered all sorts of temptations, such as prostitution and opportunities to abuse alcohol. So Utterson does not attend the theatre so that he can avoid such temptations. Utterson's attitude to alcohol and the theatre bear testimony to his self-disciplined character. Now, what is the source of his self-discipline? Well, it's likely that Utterson is self-disciplined because he is all too aware of his capacity for evil. He knows that he could easily fall into a life of vice and immorality. While Utterson appears to be a moral, respectable gentleman, he recognizes that he is vulnerable to all sorts of immoral desires. Utterson therefore avoids temptation. He gets rid of his taste for vintage wine because he is aware that he could become an alcoholic. And he avoids the theatre because he is aware that he could be tempted to engage in all sorts of immoral behaviour. So Stevenson thus begins this novel by introducing Gabriel Utterson and describing this character's self-disciplined behaviour. Now this leads us to a question. Why does the author begin the novel in this way? Well, I would suggest that Stevenson is establishing Utterson as the novel's moral compass. In other words, Utterson represents the narrative standard for moral behaviour. He represents the way that people should act. Utterson seems to embody society's expectations for the behaviour of respectable gentlemen. So Stevenson is using his opening extract to establish the novel setting. He is introducing us to Victorian London. The author perhaps describes Utterson's self-disciplined character in order to introduce the reader to the morality and expectations of respectable society in Victorian London. Mr. Utterson represents the way that respectable people in Victorian London are expected to act. So this presentation of Utterson as the novel's moral compass encourages the reader to compare Utterson's behaviour to the behaviour of more wayward characters. In particular, Stevenson seems to encourage a comparison between Utterson and Dr. Jekyll throughout this narrative. In fact, we could say that Utterson is set up as a foil for Dr. Jekyll. Now, a foil is a character who contrasts with another character. Utterson is a foil to Jekyll, whereas Utterson restrains his evil desires. Jekyll grants his evil desires power in the form of Mr. Hyde. And that brings us to the end of our first idea. Stevenson presents Utterson as a self-disciplined character. Let's now go on to our second idea. Utterson is curious about the evil tendencies of other people. Utterson sometimes wonders, almost with envy, at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds. In other words, Utterson sometimes thinks about the dramatic lives of those who pursue an immoral lifestyle, a lifestyle that is full of misdeeds. Now, I'm interested in this idea that Utterson looks almost with envy upon such people. Now, to envy someone means to desire something that they have. So you might envy someone's money, you might envy someone's intelligence, you might envy someone's looks. Now, Utterson is almost envious of the lives of immoral people. I wonder why this is. Well, perhaps it's because these immoral people enjoy all sorts of pleasures that Utterson is tempted to indulge in himself. Whereas Utterson is a dull and dreary lawyer who appears to have a rather mundane life characterized by moderation and self-control, He's fascinated by people who live a far more intense lifestyle of immorality and sin. So Stevenson now introduces one of the major themes of the novel. This is the theme of curiosity. Utterson is intensely curious about the nature of evil. And it's this curiosity that drives this narrative forward, as the lawyer attempts to learn more about the wicked Mr. Hyde. And that brings us to the end of our second idea. Utterson is curious about the evil tendencies of other people. Let's now go on to our third idea. Utterson is presented as a loyal and tolerant friend. Utterson has an approved tolerance of others, and tends to help rather than reprove wrongdoers. In other words, Utterson attempts to help people who live immoral lives rather than judge and reprove them. While he holds himself to a high moral standard, Utterson is willing to help companions who are far less respectable and moral than he. Stevenson also writes that Utterson is often the last good influence in the lives of downgoing men. In other words, driven by his loyal and non-judgmental regard for his friends, Utterson remains by their side, even if their wayward behaviour is ruining their lives. Such words may foreshadow Utterson's role in the rest of the novel. As we're going to learn, Utterson remains a faithful friend to Dr. Jekyll in the midst of his troubles. We've now finished our third idea. Utterson is presented as a loyal and tolerant friend. And here's our fourth and final idea. Utterson is presented as a trustworthy character. The first thing that makes Utterson trustworthy is the fact that he is a lawyer. In Victorian times, Utterson's profession would have been regarded as a respectable career. Utterson is therefore likely to hold a reputation as a man of integrity and sound judgment. Now, Utterson very much acts in accordance with this reputation throughout the novel. He consistently demonstrates that he is factually minded, attentive, and honest. It is therefore unsurprising that so many people should go to Utterson for support when they are in difficulty. He is a sort of reliable friend that you would go to if you ever needed help. Now, these trustworthy virtues make Utterson's perspective reliable. Now, it is fitting that chapters 1 to 8 are therefore written from Utterson's perspective. Utterson's trustworthy perspective makes the events of this narrative seem all the more believable to the reader. Utterson is also described as rather dusty, dreary, and backward in sentiment. The words dusty and dreary suggest that Utterson is rather dull. The words backward in sentiment suggest that Utterson lives by traditional values. So Utterson's life is probably rather stable and mundane. He doesn't have much of an imagination. His mind is firmly grounded in reason, logic, and tradition. Such characteristics make Utterson's perspective perfect for this book. As a Gothic novel, Jekyll and Hyde describes increasingly fantastical and bizarre events, the sort of events which do not occur in real life. But since these events are told from Utterson's grounded, rational perspective, the novel seems all the more plausible for us, the reader. And that's us finish our fourth and final idea. Utterson is presented as a trustworthy character. Let's just revise our 4 main ideas from this video. Number 1, Stevenson presents Utterson as a self-disciplined character. Number 2, Utterson is curious about the evil tendencies of other people. Number 3, Utterson is presented as a loyal and tolerant friend. And number 4, Utterson is presented as a trustworthy character. And that's us finish our video for today. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. You can see more Jekyll and Hyde videos on the playlist on this page. I will also be releasing more content across the coming weeks and months. But for now, all the best.